Fantastic. Well, it's great to see so many familiar names and faces. Good afternoon. Welcome to this Burton Suite lunchtime charity catch-up. We're really glad to see you. As I say, lots of familiar names and faces, but if you are here for the first time, you're very, very welcome indeed. We're really pleased that you've come along. My name is Ed Marsh and I'm Head of Charity Development at Burton Suite. And I'm joined here by my colleague Cecile Gillard, and she's Charity's Legal Manager. And we hope that our time together proves to be really, really helpful to you as you serve your charity or indeed your charities. You know, as a team here at Burton Suite, we love the charity sector and we're really committed to helping you and helping the charities that you serve, really to do the good, to carry out the good that you are set up to do. And we're really passionate about doing that. And we hope that today is a valuable use of your time as you pursue that too. If you're new to these events, then just to say that the format is a bit like this, that we'll have, the whole event will be about 1 hour long. And we'll have a chance for about 45-50 minutes. Cecile and I will be sharing some content with you. And then there'll be an opportunity towards the end for some questions and some answers so that we have an opportunity to learn from one another as well. Just a few practicalities as we begin. Feel very free to make use of the chat functionality as part of the meeting today. You might want to put some comments, sort of add some resources or ideas of your own. You might also like to ask some questions, and any questions that you post in the chat we'll seek to answer as we get towards the end of the event. There'll also be an opportunity to ask a question out loud if you'd like to do that towards the end. But also just to say, you may have noticed already, but we're recording this event for the benefit of those that signed up but weren't able to join us at the last minute. And so we'll be sending and recording this event to all of those delegates signed up, along with a copy of the slides. I'll just say we'll endeavour to make sure that there are no names or faces on that recording, unless, of course, you ask a question at the end. But you know, just to let you know that you'll also be able to get access to this recording after if you'd like to revisit any of the content. And our topic today is charities and trading. You know, the COVID pandemic has been a time of real pressure for the charity sector, and particularly on charity finances. You know, research just in the last couple of weeks showed that 1 in 4 charities had to dig into their reserves to make it through, given the impact of their income during the pandemic. A recent survey found that in the UK, on average, the percentage of people who said they'd given to charitable causes fell from 75% the previous year to 63% in 2020. And of course, what we know is that the longer term impact on the economy of the pandemic and the longer term impact on the funding environment that charities are operating in is going to be a real challenge. It's going to cause all kinds of pressures. And what this really means is that for us as charities, we are going to be probably spending more time thinking of those creative ways in which we can raise funds, how we can sustain our charitable work. And our experience is that many more people are asking us questions about trading activities and what charities can and can't do and the frameworks that are relevant to those. And so we wanted to give a chance in this event to give a bit of an overview of the key considerations and those key frameworks, those key things that you need to be thinking about when it comes to charities and trading. But just to say, you know, this is very much as an overview. We always welcome direct conversations about particular circumstances, and then there are always nuances and always kind of more detail to be talking about in individual circumstances. So, out of this event, if there's something that's shared today, you think, oh, actually, I need to explore that more in my context, we would really love to hear from you, and we'll be mailing you after this event with an opportunity to reply and ask us any questions or to obtain any more tailored advice if you need it. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Cecile, who's going to take us through the first session. And Cecile, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Good morning, everybody. I'm Cecile Gillard. As Ed says, I am the legal manager here, helping charities and community interest companies, all kinds of social impact organisations around their legal issues, constitutional, regulatory and governance matters. So we're going to start exploring about charities and trading. I think because of the nature of charities, because of the essence of our wonderful charity sector, it's quite often the case that people don't recognise that their charity is trading. And so, because of that, I thought perhaps we'd start with the question, does your charity trade? Now, think of a charity that you work for, or support, or advise. Think of one where you're a trustee, or perhaps in an officer capacity like the treasurer. Remember that churches are charities too, so think quite widely here and ask yourself the question, does your charity trade? And let's just take a quick on-screen poll. Does your charity trade? So at the moment, bearing in mind we're just starting to explore, 52% of you think that the charity you thought of is trading. 40% think it's not, and a relatively minor percentage of you, 8%, aren't quite sure. Thanks, Ed, that's great. So that brings us to the question, does your charity trade? And indeed the question, can your charity trade? So we need to explore a little around what trading is. There's no complete legal definition of what trading is. When it's come before the courts to consider, which is of course where legal issues can ultimately be tested, as it were, the courts have tended to concentrate on things called badges of trade. These are kind of indicators as to whether a particular set of circumstances amounts to trading or doesn't amount to trading. And they can cover things like, have there been systematic and repeated transactions? In terms of the seller, how did the seller fund the costs of what was being sold? How did they fund it? How did they provide the ultimate costs themselves in buying the things they needed to carry out the selling? And indeed, how the sale itself was carried out. A profit motive can be taken into account, but interestingly, it's not necessarily always necessary for the law to regard a situation as trading. Now, these indicators are really essentially developed from tax-related challenges about what is trading. And so they tend to also focus on the selling of goods. They don't always fit terribly well with what's going on in charity trading in our sector. So we need to be a little bit circumspect when we're looking at this. Includes the fact that, of course, charities trade in all sorts of ways, and they could be selling goods, and some do, but very, very, very often they're really selling services, and there may be some physical goods related to the delivery of those services. And sometimes they're providing both goods and services for a fee. Also, we can, I think, be confused because of the question of who's doing the paying. Sometimes the actual user of what is sold is doing the paying, but sometimes someone else has been paying on their behalf. But there's still an actual sale and there's still trading going on. In essence, if an organisation is providing goods or services to anyone and a fee is being paid, whether that's the person who's directly receiving the services or the goods or being paid by someone else, then in essence, that's very likely to be trading. So that's the kind of scenario to keep in your head. Is something being provided in return for an actual payment? Broadly speaking, somewhere along the line, there'll be a contract involved, but it might not necessarily be called a contract, and that might not be an obvious clue to spot. Sometimes the charity is trading itself directly, and sometimes there's trading being undertaken on behalf of the charity and for the benefit of the charity. If you're thinking of examples of where there might be trading going on, think of a charity that's got a service level agreement, an agreement with a local authority, for example, for the provision of services. Now, I know that some of you in the room are in that situation. It's quite common amongst charities. Where there's a service level agreement and the organisation is being paid, the charity is being paid by another organisation for providing the services, again, that's almost certainly a kind of trading relationship going on. So for example, let's take a homelessness charity. it might be being paid by a local authority to provide a night shelter for homeless people. Or we might have a charity with learning difficulties, which is being paid by that local authority to provide supported accommodation for those people to live in. In each case, there's a sale going on of what's being provided, and there is trading going on. So those are some of the examples of trading carrying on under an agreement with a third party, and there might be something akin to a service level agreement in place. Now, as you know, charities aren't like other organisations in very many ways. And because of the very nature of charities and because of the charity law setting in which they operate, we need to understand that quite unlike other organisations, we need to be really clear about the different types of trading carried on by charities or for their benefit. And here we move, Ed, thank you, to the next slide. The first one I want to draw out an understanding of is primary purpose trading. This is where there's trading carrying on with the main purpose of direct pursuit of the charity's charitable purposes, its objects, and for delivery of public benefit by doing that trading activity. Notice the importance here of the motivation. The core motivation here is the charitable outcomes. That's the why of the trading. The charity might be aiming to break even financially or cover its costs, could be aiming to make a modest surplus from the trading in terms of the costs against income. But income generation isn't the core motive. The core motive here is to take homeless people off the streets, feed hungry people, or whatever else is relevant to that charity's purposes and charitable outcomes. Now, quite a few of you thought your charity was trading, and there's some really interesting comparisons here about how many charities are doing primary purpose trading. If you look at the whole registered charity sector, and you look at charities with income above £500,000 a year, of total annual income in that part of the registered charity sector, about 52% is coming from primary purpose trading. That's quite high. Amongst the charities that wanted to join us today and charities that people joining us today are connected with, I had a quick look. The primary purpose percentages for you range from, in some cases, virtually nothing, through to, I think, one of the largest ones I noticed, ranges were 30%, 45%, and actually one, which was broadly speaking around 80% of its total income was from direct trading in pursuit of its primary purpose. Non-primary purpose trading, on the other hand, is trading with the principal purpose of generating income for the charity. This isn't a charitable activity. This doesn't provide charitable outcomes directly. The why is the income generation. And the fact that the income is then used by the charity in order to fund its charitable activities does not make this primary purpose trading. So it's an absolutely fundamental distinction you have to make all the time. Is this trading to deliver the charitable outcomes directly within our charitable purposes, or is this to generate income that we're then going to use as funding towards our charitable activity? The importance of motive. One other distinction to draw, and this is much smaller numbers of charities doing this and usually much smaller levels of income, but ancillary trading. That's trading closely linked to the direct charitable trading and able to be considered as part of the primary purpose trading. A couple of quick examples: a charitable theatre selling refreshments to ticket holders only during the interval in a performance, or a charitable hospital selling perhaps some toiletries, maybe flowers in hospitals that still allow those, to patients and to visitors coming to see patients. Thank you, Ed. Next visual. So let's look at some real life examples. Let's think about a charitable museum that's charging for general entry to that museum. Here's an example: Aerospace Bristol, the museum operated by the Bristol Aero Collection Trust charity, there's a fee to visit the entire site and everything within that museum. Other charitable museums only charge for special exhibitions. There's general free entry and they charge for special exhibitions. Example of that on the national scale, the Natural History Museum takes that approach. So it's trading when it's admitting people to its special exhibitions and charging. What about some performing arts charities? Well, selling tickets to performances that use unusual venues. Insane Root Theatre Company does that. Or supposing it was a charitable arts company where its purposes were to educate the public about Shakespeare, selling tickets to the performances. Shakespeare at the Tobacco Factory, and on a national scale, the Royal Shakespeare Company. You might have a charitable school, college, or other learning venue, could be an adult learning venue, and that charges fees for people attending its courses. On the big and national scale, Wells Cathedral School is a fee-charging school, charging fees for teaching all its pupils at all ages. On a scale on for adult education, for adult learning, Bristol Folk House charges for its courses that adults can attend. A residential care charity charging for accommodation for older people. On a national scale again, the Methodist Homes, MHA, it's one of the in fact, the biggest charitable provider of accommodation to older people in the country. A very big local charity example, St Monica Trust, charging for its various forms of accommodation. A charitable daycare centre for people with disabilities, charging for attendance at activities at the centre. And in wildlife charities, some of them charge for entry to nature reserves, the RSPB does so. In heritage charities, some of them charge for access to their heritage properties. The National Trust does so. If you're not a member, you pay to go into National Trust houses and other premises. What about the non-primary purpose examples generating income? Well, if our charity operated a cafe that's open to the general public, where the front door is on the high street, where it's in a part of the premises where the public can come in without taking part in the charitable activities, then that's income generating trading, not primary purpose trading. Another example, selling new goods like clothing, or something imaginative like refillable water bottles, or water for drinking supplied in non-plastic reused bottles. Charity doing that would be, for example, Frank Water. And then perhaps a charity with some spare car parking space that lets it to local businesses for their staff to use. Non-primary purpose trading, the objective is income generation. Thank you, Ed. So the underlying legal basis on which charities can trade has to relate to the powers and the authority of the trustees and the powers of the charity. For all types of trading, they can only be done within the charity's powers. So it can be really important to think about the Constitution. It might have restrictions. This might include a ban or a restriction on regular or permanent trading by or on behalf of the charity. You can find that quite commonly in particularly slightly older constitutions. It was drafted when the world was, as it were, a different place. If we're thinking about primary purpose trading, of course, we have to revisit the charity's purposes. If our homelessness charity, which I used as an example, had purposes to help homeless young people in the city of Bristol, then it can't rent its charitable accommodation for those formerly homeless young people to young people from other places. And then we need to think about the trustees' responsibilities in relation to trading. Where we're looking at charging for the charitable activities, services or goods, then we need to think through the issues around public benefit and restricting accessibility to the public because there's a charge. We need to think through how the trustees have justified those fees, how they've set them, what benchmarks have they used, how have they costed things. And very importantly, how are they being public about all of that? How are they being open? I was actually surprised in looking at some of the charities that I thought would be relevant to today. Some are very open and very clearly explain how they've set those fees, how they go about reviewing them. But some of them, frankly, it was utterly obscure as to what they were charging for and how they'd calculated charges and how that would be justifiable. There was quite a difference of approach. Other things trustees need to think about in relation to their responsibilities on trading, and this is all forms of trading, well, exercising usual levels of care over financial management and risk management. And there I'm thinking of all kinds of risks, not just the financial risks. Making sure that the charitable funds and the charitable assets are used correctly to pursue the charitable purposes and not put at undue risk of loss, for example. Ensuring the charity's longer-term financial viability and protecting its solvency. Complying with that governing document of the charity, making sure it doesn't go beyond the terms of that governing document. Really important too to safeguard the charity's reputation and good standing, and indeed remember that that has an impact on the whole sector's reputation. And then depending on the kind of trading we're doing, there'll be a host of other relevant legal requirements you may need to juggle. Think about regulations relating to premises use, internet trading and other forms of distance selling, or financial services rules, for example, around accepting card payments, and normal issues around contracts. And then, of course, there's a host of matters around rating and tax and VAT that need to be correctly dealt with. Those are just some headlines around the trustee responsibilities, and I'll now hand over to Ed, who's going to talk around some other subjects.
Thank you so much, Cecile. As Cecile mentioned, there's lots and lots of considerations when we're thinking about charities and trading. And Cecile mentioned there the tax and VAT implications. So I'm going to chat about those for a few minutes. So if you have a strong coffee next to you, now is the time to reach for it and take a sip, because we're going to head straight into tax and VAT when it comes to charity trading. Because partly we need to ask ourselves the question, why does it matter? Why is it important? And actually, this is a sentence perhaps we hear quite frequently as we chat to people, and it's an easy misunderstanding to have. That actually, gosh, we're a charity, so surely tax isn't relevant to us. Charities don't pay tax, and so why do we even need to be thinking about it? Whereas actually, when we read HMRC's guidance for charities and tax, it's made clear that it's not that simple. There's full of sort of qualifications. If your organisation is recognised as a charity for tax purposes, it may qualify for a number of tax exemptions and reliefs on some activities. In order to claim these, you need to apply for recognition. This doesn't mean that charities never pay tax. And so what's clear is that when it comes to tax and VAT, there are things to consider for charities around trading. There's a key underpinning principle that is true for all charities when it comes to tax, and that's that where there are reliefs, tax reliefs, that actually they're only available if the charity uses or spends the money it receives on its charitable purposes. That if it spends it on for the public benefit that it's been set up to do. And so that's a key throughout everything we do, whether it's trading or not. Anything a charity does needs to be underpinned by that principle that we need to deploy our money towards our charitable purposes. So what are some of the implications around direct tax and charity trading? Now, direct tax, I guess there's two things we're thinking about here. One is that for charitable companies, or indeed for charitable incorporated organisations, they're potentially subject to the corporation tax regime, whereas a charitable trust would be subject to income tax. So there's these kind of two alternative headings, I guess. I think the important thing to say here is that actually legislation over the years has brought things to a point where actually there's very little difference in how charities are treated when it comes to either corporation tax or income tax. So a lot of these principles we're going to be talking about are the same, whether you are an incorporated charity or a CIO, or indeed an unincorporated charity. And so Cecile's already mentioned here about various forms of charity trading. She talked of primary purpose trading, and within that, ancillary trading, trading that is sort of linked to our primary purpose, that's kind of a normal and expected part, if you like, of the trading we undertake. There's actually another form which is we see every now and then, which is trading that is undertaken primarily or mainly by beneficiaries. That in itself can form part of the primary purpose trade of a charity. But what are the tax implications? Well, in general, the picture looks like this. That actually, if you're undertaking primary purpose trading, ancillary trading, or indeed beneficiary trading, that actually that is exempt from direct tax, either corporation tax or income tax. And so actually, so long as you are trading in that way, actually a charity can carry out as much of that trading as it would like to, and not be concerned about incurring a tax liability. And so if that's the nature of what your charity does, that's fantastic, but be clear that it's primary purpose trading. However, non-primary purpose trading, you'll remember that's where there's a motive of wanting to raise money for the charity rather than generate funds in the course of doing your charitable activity. That actually fundamentally that kind of trading is taxable for a charity. However, it does depend on scale, and it's possible for charities to undertake small scale non-primary purpose trading and not to be concerned about tax. And so just to outline that for you, that non-primary purpose trading is exempt for direct tax under these limits. So where the turnover from all non-primary purpose trades is either less than £8,000 a year, or actually it's less than 25% of the gross income of the charity, and that's subject to an upper limit of £80,000. So, for example, a charity that has a total income of £500,000 a year, £500,000, it can undertake up to 80,000 non-primary purpose trading income by turnover. A charity which is £300,000 income would only be able to undertake 25% of gross income, which would be £75,000. So that is what a charity can do, and not be concerned about incurring a tax liability. And I think the important thing to say here is two important things. One is that if you expect to breach those limits, then it's not just the amount that gets breached that gets taxed, it's the whole amount. So actually, if you actually expect to, over the coming year, have £85,000 or £90,000 of non-primary purpose trading income, that whole trading the profits from that trading is subject to tax. So that's just an important thing to bear in mind, but it is based on the expectations at the start of the year. So actually, if your expectations at the start of the year that your trading, non-primary purpose trading, would be 50,000, but actually you had a bumper year and it ended up being 85, 90,000, as long as you can demonstrate that your expectations at the start of the year were that it would be lower, then there's not an issue there. So it's just important proactive planning is always an important thing, but keeping record of what your expectations are at the start of the year. So just be clear about small scale exemption for non-primary purpose trading. And then the excitement of VAT. We love VAT. It always puts a smile on our faces. I think the really important thing to say, and this is subject to a lot of confusion by people, is that we've talked quite a lot so far about primary purpose and non-primary purpose trading, and the fact that actually motive is absolutely key. The really important thing to say about VAT is that a charity is subject to VAT in the same way as any other entity, that actually there are very few charity-specific exemptions, and the motive is not relevant when it comes to VAT. The key driver is not the status of the entity or the type of purpose that they're seeking to achieve. Actually, it's the nature of what is being supplied that drives whether VAT is relevant or not. And the key question to ask is this: are the supplies business supplies? Now, to be clear about this, that the opposite of business is not charitable. It's not that, either we're doing charitable stuff or we're doing business stuff. That's not the meaning here when it comes to the VAT legislation. Actually, the fundamental principle is one that Cecile talked a bit about earlier on. That the fundamental position is that a business supply is where you are supplying something in return for some kind of consideration. It's a deal, it's a trade, it's a we give you this if you give us that. And so that's really fundamentally what a business supply is in essence. The opposite of a business supply is, and this is not designed to be any kind of joke, it's a non-business supply. It's usually a transaction where actually it's a one-way transaction. It's perhaps a donation or it's a grant with very few strings attached. It's a one-way transaction. It's not a supply in return for consideration. And so we have different kinds of supplies that a charity makes. They can either be business supplies, and then you've got a whole bunch of categories as to where that sits and what rate of VAT is charged or not. Then you have non-business, which effectively is just completely outside the scope of VAT. And so the key thing for us to bear in mind when it comes to our trading activities, regardless of whether they're primary purpose or non-primary purpose, is that where they are business supplies, if we actually are making business supplies, taxable business supplies greater than £85,000, then we need to register for VAT by law. There is the option to voluntarily register if you're lower than that, but that's a really important thing to have a conversation about. Those are not things you take lightly, and we would love to help you explore those things. So that's tax and VAT. But I do want to mention something here, that there is an exemption around fundraising events. And so both from a direct tax or a VAT point of view, if you're having a fundraising event to raise funds for your charity, or indeed a subsidiary undertakes those events, that there is an exemption from tax, both direct tax and VAT. But it's really important. There are some conditions around this, and you can see those listed on the screen there. But just to draw attention to that fourth one, not more than 15 such events of the same kind or location a year. And you can see what they're shooting at here, because what they're saying, actually, when does a fundraising event become a trading activity? And so it's to be really clear, it's a fundraising event, but primarily it's promoted as an event to raise funds for the charity. And so where there's supply of goods or services linked with that event, they can be a VAT exempt, or actually you can opt if you are VAT registered, but I won't go down that rabbit hole. But those fundraising events are not relevant when it comes to tax in that way. So what do we do if we are a charity that wants to undertake significant non-primary purpose trading activities? We need to generate funds for our charity. Donations are going through the floor. The pandemic has had a devastating impact on our ability to sustain our work. What are we going to do about it? And it might very well be that you are looking at undertaking trading activities where you need to, in bearing in mind all that's been discussed around the constitution of the charity, or on the trustee responsibilities around trading, what are some of the ways in which that can happen? And there's a key solution that you may be aware of, and that is to potentially form a trading subsidiary. A trading subsidiary is a separate legal entity, and it's usually set up to be able to conduct non-primary purpose trades that are either too large or actually they're too risky for the charity themselves to undertake. Perhaps you realise that the charity, it's too much risk to the charity's assets. It's too much for the charity to handle, or perhaps it's the direct tax and VAT considerations that drive it. And so a charity might consider setting up a separate legal entity. And typically that's a private limited company that's limited by shares, and the charity takes all of the shares, or maybe it's just one share, takes the share in the trading subsidiary, and sets up this separate legal entity to be able to undertake these activities. There's lots of reasons to do that, and I've mentioned some of them already. Risk management is key, but actually what we've often seen is that having a separate entity where there can be a distinct focus on the commercial motive, the how do we help this entity to generate as much money as possible for the benefit of the charity, and let's put that in a separate entity. So we're very clear about what our motives are. We're really clear that these activities are commercially driven activities. They're not activities driven to provide public benefit. And also, obviously the tax and VAT points, because perhaps a non-primary purpose trading is above the thresholds, and you need the ability to be able to do more than that. And so you can, within a trading subsidiary, trade to your heart's content. You can undertake unlimited amounts of non-primary purpose trading within that separate entity. But within that, there is provision to be able to make a donation from that trading subsidiary to the parent charity under the corporate gift aid scheme. And that in itself will mitigate any corporation tax liability in the trading subsidiary. The charity receives a donation, and it's a really tax efficient way of actually that activity generating money for the charity, but in a separate entity. It's a complex area. There's lots to consider around that. But one of the benefits there is of having a wholly owned trading subsidiary where a charity or charities wholly owned subsidiary is that you get a bit of time after the year end to calculate what your taxable profits are, to be able to decide what is the best donation amount to be able to mitigate your tax liability. And you've got this 9-month period where you can calculate those profits. Really important though, within that 9 months, the donation itself from the subsidiary to the charity does need to actually have been paid over, and that's really important. There's all kinds of considerations around that, but I think I just want to make the general comment before I hand back over to Cecile that actually, to be honest, we don't see many excellent examples of trading subsidiaries. We see a lot of issues with trading subsidiaries. We see a lot of problems that there are with them, and it's all to do with how they are seen, how they are set up, and how they are managed. And so here are some of the pitfalls and the problems that we see in practice. And then what we're going to do, we obviously want to turn that around and be positive and to say, how do you set up a trading subsidiary for success? But firstly, the problems. I think one of the problems we see in practice is that there's very little independence between the charity and the subsidiary. That actually the governing boards are effectively the same body of people, that actually sometimes the finances are not separated at all. Maybe even the trading subsidiary just shares the charity's bank account. It uses the same accounting system file, that actually there's no real kind of separate board meetings that are for that trading company. And so actually it's all a bit random. Bills are paid from whichever checkbook is nearest, or whichever bank account has the most money in, without really thinking, which entity is this relevant to here? That actually there's not attention paid on governance being strong within the trading company to be able to do what it needs to do. We often find that trading subsidiaries don't have sufficient working capital because, what happens, of course, is that they seek to donate as much of their profit as possible to the charity to mitigate tax. And so you end up sort of draining of all their working capital. There's not much cash left. And so often they're on the edge of insolvency because something goes a bit wrong and they tip over the edge. And then really sadly, we see a lot of situations where the subsidiary runs out of money and the charity decides to bail it out by giving it some cash to help it in its situation. Well, the charity might as well go down to local McDonald's and hand over some cash to the local McDonald's. It's not within their gift to be able to bail out the trading subsidiary, except in very, very limited and exceptional circumstances. Often one of the challenges is that there is a mismatch between the calculation of taxable profits and accounting profits. And so subsidiaries sometimes either end up with a residual tax liability of some description, or they've accidentally paid too much profit over to the subsidiary beyond what company law requires. There's a whole lot of stuff to explore there. There's a lack of clarity in terms of which entity activity should take place in. Quite often we see primary purpose activity taking place in a trading subsidiary. That's not a complete no-no, but actually if a primary purpose activity is not necessarily set up in a way to be profitable, you can end up draining a trading subsidiary of its and there's a real lack of clarity there on what happens. We end up seeing situations where the charity loans money to the subsidiary, but actually they're not on normal commercial terms. And actually that is the charity doing itself out of, it's not protecting the charity assets, it's doing itself out of funds, it's effectively donating or giving money. And actually, if you're not careful, you end up with a non-commercial and non-charitable loan, which ends up incurring a tax liability in the charity in any case. And then every now and then we see situations where the tail is wagging the dog a little bit too much. where actually all the thrust of enthusiasm and drive is in the trading subsidiary. All the kind of the energy and the vision goes into the money-making activities within the trading subsidiary. And actually it's forgotten that the whole reason for the trading subsidiary in the first place was to raise money to support the charity's purpose. So there's a whole load of really negative things to say about what we see in practice. But I'm just going to ask Cecile now to just highlight in her experience and in what we would love to see. What is a well-run trading subsidiary? What does that look like? And she's going to make some comments, and then I'm going to make some comments following that.
Thank you, Ed. So a well-run subsidiary, what would it look like? Well, the point that Ed made about tail not wagging dog and focus is a really important one. In a well-run trading subsidiary, the trustees have the right and proper perspective to help them run it well. They keep their focus on the fact that the subsidiary is an asset of the charity, and it's an asset that it owns in order to generate funds that come back to the charity that the charity uses for the charitable activities. That's the only reason that it exists. And keeping that focus is hugely, hugely important. The trustees also need to recognise that it's an investment of the charity. And that means it needs to be managed and monitored just like any other investment would be. The trustees' legal duties in investment matters apply to their oversight of the subsidiary, and they need to be rigorous in that. They also need to have adequate trustee oversight of the activities of the trading subsidiary and the trading subsidiary's affairs. They absolutely should not hand the trading subsidiary over to its board or its staff and leave them to get on with things. So regular reporting to the trustee board is important. And that reporting needs to be actively discussed by trustees. There needs to be critical analysis of the trading activity and the trading company, and appropriate challenge needs to be there. It needs to be demonstrable. Then within the governance structure of the subsidiary and the charity as well, we need to get the balance right. So in the subsidiary, appropriate levels of trustee representation on the subsidiary's board. Enough of the trustees are on the subsidiary's board to recognise that the subsidiary exists to serve the charity by income generating trading. Enough non-trustee directors to provide expertise in the relevant trading fields, to give some further objectivity and independence of focus on the subsidiary. And then on the trustee board itself, enough trustees on that board who are not on the subsidiary's board to again bring independence and critical thinking to the board discussions and decisions about the subsidiary and its trading activity. And this care to take balance into account on both boards can help with addressing conflicts of loyalty and conflicts of interest issues, which to some extent are built into owning a trading subsidiary, and in some situations will become sharper and need a better focus and more careful management. And the charity shouldn't take things on trust. It needs proper written arrangements with its subsidiary. That may very well include some kind of agreement between the two as to certain issues. And importantly, it's vital that the trading subsidiary's articles give the charity adequate safeguards, safeguarding the charity's rights and interests. For example, so that it could be sure that it could, if necessary, take a judgment on removing subsidiary directors, that subsidiary directors can't come onto the board unless the charity's board has approved them, and a range of other protections and rights. And you don't get that without carefully crafting the articles of the charity subsidiary. And to a certain extent, some of that's situation specific, depending on the nature of the charity as well. So those are some of the factors about helping you run a trading subsidiary well. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Cecile. Just some additional points from me. It's really important to plan carefully at the setup stage the resources that the subsidiary will have at its disposal. What assets does it need to hold itself? What people are running that activity? Actually, for lots of reasons, it's often quite sensible to hold assets and actually perhaps employ people within the charity and actually to make an arm's length sensible charge to the subsidiary for the use of those assets and those people. That's actually, there's actually tax advantages in doing that. It makes things a lot simpler. But I think the really important thing, and as Cecile mentioned about setting up proper agreements within but between the charity and the trading subsidiary, that actually one thing that agreement should cover is, what resources can the trading subsidiary use and at what charge. It's really important that the charity receives adequate recompense for any resources that it seeks to, that is borrowed or is purchased by the subsidiary. It's really important to ensure that the trading subsidiary is properly funded as well. I mean, any commercial organisation will start with a business plan. It will start with, these are the funds that we need at the start to be able to undertake the trading that we're going to do. And just expecting a subsidiary to start on zero or to start with a nominal amount in the bank account is not going to help. So to think about how it's properly funded at the start, so that actually there's not a continued kind of call on to be funded in other ways. It's not going to be very, very easy for a trading subsidiary to go out to the market and get funds from elsewhere, because it's the only profits it's generating are going to a charity. It's not really going to. It's not going to be able to give its profits out to other shareholders or other holders of finance. So it's really important to think about the funding. We've already hammered this point home, but loans on normal commercial terms with an interest rate, with a repayment plan, absolutely vital. And what we would expect to see always in a well-run subsidiary is that, generally speaking, there's a consistent flow of funds from the subsidiary to the charity and not the other way around. That actually, whether that's the payment of management charges, whether that's the donation of profits going that way, we wouldn't expect to see very commonly the charity making payments to the subsidiary unless it's for very, very clear, for example, the charity purchasing services from the trading subsidiary. And then a well-run subsidiary always has sensible financial management with budgets, with cash flow forecasting, with plans, with a rigorous review undertaken of the finances, the financial management and the activities of the trading subsidiary, and a real sense of awareness and lines of reporting to the charity's board on the success or otherwise of the trading subsidiary. So those are some really important points. For us, that was a whistle-stop tour of charities and trading, and really sort of just touching the surface. I hope that's been helpful to you. Again, we would encourage you to come to us with direct questions about your particular circumstances for help if you've got particular areas of concern there. In a few minutes' time, we're going to invite you to ask any questions. So just a reminder, if you would like to put any questions in the chat, you might like to merrily do that now, or be thinking of any questions that you'd like to ask out loud. But one thing we do at these events is we always want to take the opportunity to keep you up to date with the latest news and developments. We're keen that this is a forum where you can just make sure you're up to speed with perhaps the latest things that are coming out in the charity press, or up to speed with the latest things from the regulator and so regulators. So I'm just going to hand over to Cecile just to pick up a couple of particularly pertinent recent developments.
Thank you, Ed. So two things I was going to touch on and mention here. The Charity Commission has renamed its guidance for faith-based charities, and it's now called Managing Faith Charities as Trustees. Don't be misled by that. It's not new guidance, despite the Commission's comments on social media. Much of the material is exactly as it was. And also, don't be misled by the title. It's not just for trustees, it's for staff within faith-motivated charities as well. There's some important material here. The way the guidance is presented now has been reordered, and most importantly, it's been reordered so it's more clear, where it's linking you through to guidance on areas that are relevant to all charities, not just those that are motivated in some sense by faith or exist for faith activities. And that's partly because the Commission sees so many cases of faith charities getting things wrong in relation to important general matters for charities. The relatively small number of comments that are specifically faith-focused are particularly putting emphasis around issues of power and authority dynamics, the importance of balancing openness and trust and acceptance of people with the need to keep everybody safe, the need for clarity of roles where spiritual leaders are also trustees. And these are some of the areas where difficulties do arise in faith charities, and the Commission sees these difficulties, as indeed do people like us who support faith charities amongst that wonderful dynamic of all other charities. The Commission reinforces the point that all trustees share equal responsibility and individuals must not dominate, and one must have a balance of views and a balance in the decision-making and leadership functions. One of the things that struck me as a big gap here was in relation to financial security and probity. There really has nothing been added about non-cash giving and non-cash donations, things like e-donations, the ever-growing range of online giving and the various ways that's structured with third-party platforms and providers, often a chain of different third parties involved in how the online gift gets to the charity. This is true for all charities as well as faith charities, but we know that faith charities have expanded their use of these hugely during the pandemic, as many anyway charities have, and there's a much greater volume of funds flowing into charities that way, and a much greater variety of ways they do. And to assume that we're still talking about counting cash collections as the principal way we're dealing with our income is, I think, less than helpful. So there's some real gaps there. We're thinking about putting on an event targeted towards faith-based charities, and we'd be really interested about your ideas for helpful content for that event. So please do share those with us today, certainly, but also after this event, please share them with us. The other area I was going to touch on, the Commission's most recently issued independent research into public trust and confidence in charities. There's some positives here. Certainly a positive for me was that there's a general awareness that charities have risen to the exceptional circumstances brought about by the pandemic, which is encouraging because those of us involved with charities know how much we've done and we're still doing around that and how much we've had to help society cope with that. Very positive to see there's a small overall increase over the last couple of years in public trust and confidence. So we're going in the right direction. Charity sector is still much more trusted than many other areas of public life, and right up at the top of that level of trust. But the level of trust in charities remains not quite where it was at its high point in 2014. That, of course, was just before we got to a terrible period where there was a number of high-profile criticisms of charities and a number of very well-publicised examples of allegedly poor behaviour, abuses, scandals that happened over several years. So that's still having its impact, and it takes a long time to rebuild from these things, even from those of us, which is most of us, where our charities have never done any such things as that. And four key drivers of public trust and confidence remain substantively where the money goes, that a high proportion of the charities funds end up used for the charitable activity. The impact that charities are making, what difference are they making on the promises they've made to make a difference? Where's the evidence for that? How do you justify that, rather than making simply bland statements about we help people who have problem X? And the how does your charity go about its affairs, from generating its income to delivering its activities? There's a really high expectation of high ethical standards. And there's a sense that there's a collective responsibility that all charities need to uphold the reputation of charity and adhering to good practices and good standards. It's not about saying we're not ABC, who's been publicised as doing things badly. It's about saying we all have a together need to do things well and be seen to do that and to be open and honest about that. Ed, thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecile. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to give an opportunity for anyone to ask any questions that you would like to ask. And so I know, thank you so much, Graham, for your comment in the chat, just saying that you understand the Charity Commission is considering new requirements to be met when a CIO charity wishes to change or amend its articles. Cecile, I don't know whether you want to comment on that, whether it's probably something to reflect on, but.
Yes, thank you, Ed. I think there's a bit of misunderstanding about that, Graham. There's nothing under consideration by the Charity Commission for changing anything in the way it would deal with a CIO altering its constitution. How a CIO may alter its constitution and when, for example, it needs prior Charity Commission consent, and the places where it can't alter its constitution or can't alter it in certain ways, that's all enshrined in the charity law that affects CIOs. And the Charity Commission is not free to change that, and it's not free to alter how it approaches its legal regulatory functions over that. I suspect where the confusion has arisen is quite a long way off, maybe a year or so. There are some changes in the Charities Bill that would impact on non-incorporated charities in some aspects, some quite technical aspects of how they can change their constitutions. That would not be relevant to CIOs and it would not be relevant to charitable companies. The one potential difference may relate to changes around charitable objects, but that's highly technical and we need other times to go into that.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to ask a question or make a comment? You can do so by just simply unmuting yourself and speaking up. That's absolutely fine. I have a question in the chat here from Amanda. Thank you, Amanda. In terms of the timing in setting up a trading subsidiary, when would one normally consider this? Would it be when the trading thresholds are breached? I'll perhaps briefly comment on that, and then perhaps, Cecile, you could mention what is involved in setting up a trading subsidiary. So I think in terms of timing, I think the important thing in terms of thresholds is to be doing it at the point where you expect in the future the thresholds to be breached. As I said earlier on, it is about expectations at the start of the year. I mean, having just breached them, for example, having not expected to, really you need to clearly ask yourself the question, what does this mean to our expectations going forward? And clearly, if nothing's changed and you really your trading activity is at that level, then setting up a trading subsidiary at this point would be a very helpful thing. Cecile, could you just comment on what's involved in setting up a trading subsidiary?
Yes, I mean, one thing to add to the when is, remember, it's not all about whether you're at the thresholds for the tax charge.
Absolutely.
It's really important that sometimes a trading subsidiary should be in place in other circumstances when you're well below that. And actually, many of the charities in the room who run a trading subsidiary, that comment is true of their scenario. So be really careful. It's not all about the tax. What's involved, it's really vital to get the constitution of the subsidiary right, to get the composition of its board right, to deal with conflicts of interest issues, to get the arrangements between the subsidiary and its charity right, and right at the very start to realise whether or not the charity has capacity to directly own it. And if it doesn't, to think about how you structure some holding of the shareholding, for example, by someone on behalf of the charity, which adds to the complications. So those are all really, really important things. Those are generalistic statements, and you absolutely should be taking situation-specific advice and getting help.
Thank you, Cecile. Wonderful. Well, we're out of time, and just to say thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that you found it really valuable. As Cecile mentioned, we're planning to in the autumn perhaps have a a special event, particularly focusing on the issues relevant to faith-based charities. There are a number of different kind of areas that are very relevant. Some of those we've mentioned. We're going to be sending you a mailing after this event asking you for feedback. We really value and listen to your feedback. Within that, there's a suggestion for content we could cover in future times, and it might be one of these times. Actually might be that particular faith-based focus event. And so we would love to hear your suggestions of what you would really appreciate hearing from us about. But also what will follow after then is a copy of the recording and the slides for you as well, so you can digest some of what we've talked about today. But again, we just want to say we are here and available to speak to you, to have specific conversations about your circumstances and to help with any particular questions you've got, and particularly to expand on any matters that you felt actually that needs a little bit more in my context. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of the day. And yeah, the sun's kind of shining here, so enjoy the sun, and we'll see you very soon. Bye for now.
Bye.